My name's David Brimage and I'm the Global Programme Manager here at TIPSI. I'm really pleased to be able to welcome all of you today, and it's great so many of you could join us. For anyone who's new to these sessions, this is a practitioner-led space where we consider the applications of TIP, Transformative Innovation Policy, tools and methodologies, and we consider that within various different contexts. And there's the opportunity there for us to learn from other contexts, learn more about the challenges that people are facing, and hopefully bring it into our own practice as well. A couple of points just to start us off before we get into the session proper. This session is going to be recorded. I hope that's okay with everyone. And with the time differences, obviously we've got a global community and not everyone can join us for each session, but recording it does allow us to share that with people and for them to watch it afterwards. I know it's not always practical, but for those of you who can, please do keep your cameras on so that everyone can see one another. And it would be great if you felt able to introduce yourself in the chat box as well, say where you're from and what your connection with TIP is. A really important element of these sessions is for them to be interactive, and you'll be pleased to know that later on in the session we've got some questions for you, and it would be great to hear about your experience as well. You may also have your own questions as the speakers go through what they want to share. Please do put those in the chat box, any questions, reflections, comments, and we'll do our best. We should have 10 minutes towards the end for sort of open questions as well. Okay, so to introduce our guests, today I'm really delighted to say that we've got from the Monash Business School. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Darren Sharp, the co-director of the Sustainability Transitions Lab, and Christoph Brodnik, the Research Knowledge Manager within the Sustainability Transitions Lab as well. Christoph's here also to share his knowledge on the project, and he's also going to be supporting us with facilitating this session as well. As you know, today's session will focus on the work of the Net Zero Precinct Living Lab at Monash University's Clayton campus. Many of you will have heard about the work already. It's been very ambitious in its scale, what it's tried to achieve, and in the breadth of the stakeholders that it's brought together. And also just in its monitoring and evaluation work, it's made use of TIPSI developed transformative outcomes, which many of you will already be familiar with. So I know you'll want to hear how they've applied the transformative outcomes. So without further ado, I will hand over to Darren. Thank you very much for putting on the session, Darren and Christoph.
Thank you so much, David. It's great to be with you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Greetings from Melbourne. I'll just share my slides with you now. I'm going to spend a bit of time now going through the Net Zero Precincts Living Lab and the project, and as David said, really speak to our monitoring, evaluation and learning approach, where we drew heavily on TIPSI's Transformative Outcomes Framework. And I just want to give a shout out to my colleague Christoph for his invaluable support on that journey, and it's great to have you with us today, Christoph. So just to kick things off, a bit about me. So I'm a urban sustainability transitions researcher and co-director of the newly created Sustainability Transitions Lab at Monash Business School. We launched at the start of this year. We're a new impact lab led by Professor Rob Raven, who many of you will be familiar with, or at least his work. We have three pillars to our lab, being firstly the circular economy led by Martin Geisdorfer, nature positive theme led by Anita Forster, and myself leading the climate safe transitions pillar. And again, these three missions really align with national and international sustainability agendas, obviously looking at significant shifts in consumption, production, policies, institutional arrangements, markets, behaviours, culture and infrastructures. If you're familiar at all with sustainability transitions, that's it in a nutshell. So do please reach out if you'd like to learn more about our lab. So to kick things off today, I really wanted to give you a bit of background and context in terms of where the Living Lab itself is situated. It was really inspired by the university's Net Zero initiative, which was launched nearly 10 years ago. So Monash University was the first Australian university to set a carbon reduction goal to get to net zero by 2030. And as you can see here, it involves a number of different initiatives, everything from energy efficiency to campus electrification. We have significant renewable energy on site, a lot of solar PVCs, but also a power purchase agreement. We have a microgrid, we have offsetting, and there's a lot of building retrofits going on. We have other aspects to this as well, related to circular economy, water sensitive urban design. So the university took really a strong leadership position in net zero going back many years. And then our project really was piggybacking off of this ambition. And we were fortunate enough to win grant funding from the Australian Research Council for what's known as a linkage project to develop this Net Zero Precincts program of work, which is a 4-year project, which is in the final year at the moment, just wrapping up. And to give you context, we're essentially trying to develop a new governance approach, trying to think about how you bring together diverse stakeholders in a university precinct. You can see the university here is really at the heart of this precinct, which is about a half an hour from the Melbourne Central Business District. It's a major employment and growth hub in the city and in the state. And essentially, we're surrounded by a whole range of different health, science, and other research organisations, including the Australian synchrotron, CSIRO, which you might be familiar with, a whole lot of corporate actors, and of course, SMEs, small to medium enterprises, startups, but a massive residential area around us too. So what's interesting is the diversity of this sort of precinct or innovation district, you might call it, and the scale of it. So the university itself is about a 1 kilometre square at the Clayton campus. So it's about a 20-minute walk in every direction. So it's very large. And the precinct, as you can see itself, is even larger still. So it's quite difficult to get around in terms of if you want to move around without using a car. So car use is still predominant. But this project is really trying to understand how can we shift the dial and bring these actors together. City of Monash, the local council, ICLEI, which you might be familiar with, CSIRO, Energy Efficiency Council, and so on, and bring these diverse actors together along with staff, students, our operations team in building and property, and really trying to understand how we can develop a new governance approach, treating the Clayton campus as a living lab, to test and learn from a range of experiments in net zero, and go through this journey together with our important partners in the community. So you can see the list of partners here at the bottom, and we couldn't have done this work without their support. And I think it's also really important to point out how closely we've worked with the operations team at Monash Buildings and Property, who are responsible for all of the facilities and the entire estate. And they've been a very big supporter and collaborator in this work, which I'll explain more in detail as we continue on. And importantly, we're bringing together two very different approaches. On the one hand, transition management, which is a process-based approach where you work with front runners to identify and frame up a range of sustainability challenges and opportunities, go through a process of envisioning the future, running experiments, and then doing monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And then we blended that together, that kind of very much a transition systems-based approach with design anthropology with our colleagues, including Professor Sarah Pink, who's a world-renowned design anthropologist, and to really try and ground this work in the needs of everyday people. So might just pause there and hand over to Christoph for the first interactive element of the session today.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Hi, my name is Christoph. We thought we wanted to get a bit of a read of the room and understand if you guys have been involved in the Living Lab or in a similar experimental initiative. So please grab your smartphones, hoping that you have one, and use your camera to scan this QR code here in the middle. And if you do that, it should take you to a Menti survey. And in that Menti survey, you get asked that question again. Have you ever been involved in a living lab? And you get 4 answer options. Please pick one and let us know. And we'll pause here for maybe 30 seconds to a minute until we get the results in, and then you can have a look at them. That's interesting. So we've got 5 people that have been involved as a researcher. I could have added myself there as well, and I guess Darren, you too. None as a practitioner. 7 people familiar with the concept but haven't been involved, and 7 that have not been involved and the concept is also new to them. So I guess we'll be sensitive to that in the following of that presentation. But thanks so much for this, and I'll hand back to Darren with that.
Thanks, Christoph. And I just want to make the point here that interestingly, most of our experiment leads, which I'll come to shortly, had not been involved in living labs before. And we actually went through quite a significant onboarding process to bring them up to speed and to build capability around that. And I'll share more details of that. So it just goes to show that you don't have to have been involved in a living lab to be able to be running experiments. So let's continue on. I just wanted to touch on briefly some insights that emerged from stage one of the project, just to give a bit of context, because it's a 4-year project. And I did mention that we are using a transition management process, which some of you might be familiar with, coming out of the work of people like Dirk Loorbach and others at the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions, our good friends over there. And so we actually worked with front runners in stage one to identify drivers and barriers to net zero transformation in the precinct. And I guess it's no wonder that these are, multidimensional, intersectoral, across energy, mobility, built environment, governance, data, circular economy, etc. The drivers and barriers focused on governance and leadership, business and investment concerns, community engagement, technology and infrastructure. And we were really open to embracing diversity here and plurality, both in terms of problems and opportunities. So, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty around the net zero transition within the precinct, as in many places. And we wanted to also lean into this idea of avoiding what Konietzko calls carbon tunnel vision. What came through very early on in the initial frontrunner work was that people were concerned about place, about social connections, about amenity, sociality, connectivity, about having nice green urban environments to live, work, and play in, to having access to good transport linkages and connections. And much more than just being concerned about energy transition or getting to zero carbon and so on. And this kind of really opened up a broader conversation for us around this idea of much more inclusive future visions and pathways to net zero that can take into account that much deeper, broader range of concerns. And then that was augmented and complemented by our friends in design anthropology, who really were able to mine the everyday life experiences of people in the precinct through some really in-depth ethnographic work as well. And that can be followed up in our stage one report. So that sort of sets the scene in terms of the early grounding work we did to identify these sort of barriers and drivers in the precinct. Then in stage two, we went on this process of envisioning net zero futures, and informed by our design anthropology friends and colleagues, we decided to actually go on these walking tours of the precinct, which you can see here in Clayton. And that was to really try and move out of that kind of typical kind of envisioning practice where people are sort of in a meeting room with maybe butcher's paper and post-it notes. We wanted to use really creative media and a creative kind of process and a grounded and embodied process, taking into account those ethnographic concerns. And so we went on these 4 walking tours to the 4 corners of the precinct. We look at new buildings like the Learning and Teaching building, the campus bus loop and the electric bus trial that's going on. We spoke to student groups, including Monash Precious Plastic, and the Woodside, formerly known as the Woodside building, which is a net zero building, which has a huge amount of solar PVC on top of the rooftop, along with many other buildings in the precinct. We looked at the Science Lake and water sensitive urban design, and the campus centre and community gardens and so on. So this really kind of was an opportunity to kind of introduce our participants, which included, as you can see at the top there, staff, students, industry, government, and community partners all coming together, I think, which is unusual in this very much a place-based context. And we invited them to actually engage with our colleagues in buildings and property in the operations side of the university to talk about these transitions in the making, as it were. And the participants in this envisioning process actually collected objects on their journeys. They collected seeds, leaves, rubbish, stories. They took field notes, they took photos, and then we brought them back into our second part of the workshop to actually go through this process of speculative prototyping, where they worked in small groups, again, really diverse stakeholders coming together to envision their net zero futures as living worlds. And so you can see here we used actual terrariums or fish tanks that we filled up with soil, and then we provided a whole range of media, and the participants themselves also brought in their own materials from their walking tours, which you can see here, some of the objects that were brought in. And we use the X-curve, if you're familiar with that, as a way to talk about how we not only can build up niche innovations and alternatives to get us to net zero faster, but also how do we phase out the unsustainable practices, unsustainable mindsets, technologies, fuel sources, whatever it might be. And so there was this whole day process of the walking tours plus the terrarium building that led to these 10 visions of the future precinct coming together. And you can see what those sort of terrariums ended up looking like, some of them. Very creative, very hands-on, and very much grounded in the place-based experience of what's happening in the precinct. And what was perhaps surprising to us was less attention on energy as a core transition domain in the 10 visions that came through. Very far-reaching ambitions for active transport, a much stronger role for nature and ecology. And really, the message that came through loud and clear was the importance of people and institutions as transition drivers, rather than technology and innovation. There are a range of other themes here, which I can't really get into, but I do encourage you to read our stage 2 report, and there will be links provided to that later on. But I'm setting the scene here so you can understand how the Living Lab work fits into this whole story here. Following the visioning process, we developed these transition pathways through a backcasting process which came together with our stakeholders about 6 months after the envisioning work. And the 6 pathways really work from where do we want to get to in 2030, how do we work back from there, and how do we develop concrete actions and activities to make that reality happen. And the 6 pathways that came together were around zero carbon mobility, circular economy, nature positive precinct. There was a governance one, an energy efficiency one, and then a degrowth and sufficiency pathway. So that work in stage 2 really set the groundwork for the Living Lab portfolio to follow. And so we worked with primarily our experiment leads, who were 5 PhD students who are in currently various stages of having completed, in the process of completing their doctoral research at the moment. And so this report here is the culmination of stage 3 of the project, which really looks at the Living Lab, and you can access the report here through those links. And what I'll do now for the next little while is take you through how we brought those experiment leads and diverse actors together around this idea of a Living Lab. And I'll take you through the portfolio and the monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework that we use, especially focusing in on the transformative outcomes approach that we were really inspired by through the work of Tipsy. And I'll take you through that now. So again, just to sort of, a lot of language here in terms of how we're thinking through this. I have a background in, urban experimentation, very influenced by this particular work. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it, The Experimental City. And we're using this definition here from this work and related work in terms of what we mean by an experiment, which is an inclusive, practice-based, challenge-led initiative designed to promote system innovation through social learning under conditions of uncertainty, ambiguity. So that's a lot of words there, but essentially we're using the Clayton campus as a real world site, a place to experiment with diverse stakeholders, trying to go through this process of learning together about transitions in the making through the Living Lab experiments, and then use monitoring and evaluation to monitor our progress and evaluate how we're doing. So what was our Living Lab trying to achieve? So essentially we're providing an enabling environment for our experiment leads. And I should give a shout out here to my good colleague, Sam Rye, who worked with me very closely to set up and run the Net Zero Precincts Living Lab. And Sam has actually gone on to lead some important work to develop Monash's Living Lab platform through the research infrastructure portfolio. And Sam is also in our Sustainability Transitions Lab and does some really great work in this space as well. So what we're doing with this particular Living Lab was trying to provide a coordinated approach for our experiment leads to engage with our partners in the project, which I've mentioned earlier. And we're also trying to develop interdisciplinary knowledge that connects theory to practice. Again, as I mentioned, bringing together transition management, design anthropology, but also speculative prototyping, speculative design, participatory design, other aspects. We brought in, obviously, through transformative outcomes, more of a focus on strategic niche management as well. And ultimately, we're trying to test new governance arrangements. So obviously, the universities are taking a net zero leadership position, but how do we bring those other partners in the precinct along that journey? And how do we get them talking together in a way that is collaborative, that's creative, that can sort of open up new opportunities for new ways of going through the process of net zero transitions at precinct scale, especially when there's no necessary market or policy direction to tell those actors what to do in any kind of coherent sense. So again, we're trying to bridge the gap between research and implementation. So this is a graphic that Sam Rye developed to sort of explain our cycles of engagement. I should say that Living Lab ran for about 2 years, and we went through this 6 to 9 month process of really onboarding and bringing our experiment leads up to speed. As I said earlier, following that mentee activity, our experiment leads hadn't been involved in a Living Lab before, and some of them were quite anxious about what it meant. And we invited them to participate in this Living Lab and to run and lead their own experiments. And that was quite daunting to many of them, if not most of them. And we had to go through this process of deep sort of collaborative work, going through a range of transition frameworks. I've mentioned some already, and also going through the understanding of how Living Labs operate, what Living Lab ways of working look like, and going through a range of different tools and methods and approaches to get our experiment leads in a mindset and into a position where they could feel comfortable and ready to actually undertake this work with our support and guidance all the way through. So then we ran these 2 cycles of experimentation, and they went for about 3 months each. And we had these pauses of about a month of learning, reflection, and adaptation before starting the second cycle. And I think we started with about 7 experiments initially in cycle 1, and then a few more joined in cycle 2 to get us up to about 10. And what that looked like, you can see a photo. The engagement itself would be these studios that we ran at the start of each cycle. And we had a showcase as well. And at these events, we brought the key actors together. You can see many of our PhD students here smiling, colleagues, Sam Rye, Shane and Ruth from Buildings and Properties team. And our portfolio actually was really diverse. Speaking to that point earlier about plurality, we wanted to open it up to whoever was in a position to be able to run an experiment. So we had our 5 PhD students. We had additional students that we picked up along the journey through our engagement and outreach activities, including a number of honours engineering students who were doing their final year projects. We had Shane French in the background here from Buildings and Property, a staff member, run an experiment on cycling. And we also had a local resident, Lee, run an experiment on urban greening. So it was diverse across buildings, across mobility and transport, across data, circular economy, urban greening, and so on. So it was a really eclectic group of experiments, all that came together under this portfolio, which ran, again, in this active kind of stage of the work for about a year. So I'll hand back to Christoph now.
Thanks, Darren. This is the second Menti part for this session. And before Darren goes into, I guess, explaining some of the successes and what he has learned through those experiments, we wanted to hear from you guys what you think living labs are best at. Can be things like knowledge creation, relationship building, changing perceptions when different actors come together, building institutional support, perhaps. So please tell us in your own words, and it's the same process as before. Please grab your smartphone, scan that code, go to Menti, take a few moments to enter your thoughts into a text box. And in terms of looking at the results, we'll do this a little bit differently this time. Darren will continue with the presentation in a while, and I'll look at the results on the back end, and then we'll come back to them at a later stage of that presentation. But take a moment, have a think, and tell us in your own words what you think living labs are good at. Great. I can see some comments, thoughts, reflections coming in. It's fantastic. We will leave this question open, so please continue to add. And I guess, Darren, you can continue with the presentation.
Thanks a lot, Christoph. So this brings us to monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which really became a critical backbone of the entire Living Lab. And in conversations I had with Christoph, I was, familiar with this amazing book, the Motion Handbook. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it or referred to it yet. And I was inspired by this approach, and it set off a number of conversations with Christoph, because we worked together and I was familiar with his work with Tipsy and all the amazing work he's been doing with the team. And so I was very impressed and decided to go down the path of drawing on this approach, theory of change, and the transformative outcomes framework to really help us with formative evaluation of the Living Lab portfolio. And so I've just got some, insights here from that handbook, which talk about how through formative evaluation, we learn to acknowledge how our experiment changes the interconnection within the system. And in doing so, and by doing so, I should say, promotes changes at the system level. And in this case, the system we're talking about is the Monash University Clayton campus and the Monash Precinct, which always enforces certain pathways of change and discourages others, what we call directionality. So in a nutshell, this requires a real-time process which is reflexive and transformative towards long-term systemic goals. And the way that I always talked about this with our experiment leads was, look, we need to be intentional about the experiments that you're leading and be able to kind of be reflexive in terms of stepping back and thinking about how they're going, and really focus on that directionality. Which direction are you going in? What assumptions are you working under? And based on the data that's been collected, how might you need to change that approach going forward? So that brings us to transformative outcomes. Again, very much informed by and inspired by amazing work that's come before through Tipsy. I highly recommend you watch this previous open learning series event from a few years ago with colleagues here, which is fantastic. And they talk about how, in the context of this work, we all have different roles to play in driving sustainability transitions, about how transformative outcomes can help us become aware of the choices we make and the directionality of our actions, about how this awareness can enable our experiments to become more transformative, and how monitoring and evaluation can help coordinate and navigate change processes. So in terms of how this came together in the Net Zero Precincts Living Lab and our monitoring, evaluation, and learning approach, what is clear is that, given the uncertain, the emergent nature of this type of work, it makes it very challenging for experiment leads to do a number of things. Firstly, they don't know where to start, right? How do I frame up my experiment? What does it look like? Then beyond that, how do you coordinate and navigate these really complex and dynamic change processes? And then furthermore, whether your experiments are leading to any changes over time. So given all of this, we decided that we would embed the transformative outcomes framework into our monitoring, evaluation, and learning approach, because it became critical for helping us steer these interventions, for generating feedback, and for enhancing the capacity of our Living Lab experiment leads to both reflect on and to adapt their practices. So this is our theory of change in one page. And I'll start from the bottom here. If you're not familiar with theory of change, again, go back and have a look at that Motion Handbook afterwards. I highly recommend you read through it, cover to cover. We talk about inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts, and of course, assumptions. And so we went through that process to structure our theory of change. And the inputs, as I've mentioned earlier, are those two, foundational approaches: transition management and design anthropology, and the earlier work that had come through stages 1 and 2 of the Net Zero Precincts project. The activities in question here are the Living Lab experiments themselves. The outputs are pretty diverse, could be everything from prototypes to visualizations, demonstrations, events, workshops, knowledge generation, and so on. Then we landed on these initially 4 transformative outcomes, with the overarching one being building capability for transition governance, starting with learning, which is really about activities that provide regular opportunities for discussing experiences, obstacles, and needs related to a new practice, as well as challenging related values and assumptions that people might have. Networking is about protecting and progressing new practices by gaining the interest of more people and creating connections between them. Navigating expectations is about creating spaces for articulating expectations around and appraising these expectations to enhance their credibility among niche actors. About quality, providing more evidence, stability, expectations are not questioned anymore, etc. Institutional change is about embedding these new and more sustainable practices in institutional settings. And as we were going about doing this work, it became clear to us that actor empowerment was a fifth transformative outcome that we started to see early signals of and was emerging. And so we decided to bring that in as a fifth transformative outcome. And that one's really focused on building agency to actively shape experimentation processes through accessible knowledge sharing, skill development, and partnering opportunities. So I talked about earlier on how none of our experiment leads had actually been involved in a living lab before. So in the process of going through this experience, the experiment leads themselves went through this process of empowerment, and we also found other participants in the living lab experiments themselves experienced similar outcomes as well. And then if we think about the overarching impacts, we're really trying to accelerate net zero precinct transitions, right? And then the assumptions, well, there are many, but the main one is that precincts are an optimal scale to test and develop net zero urban solutions. Because as I mentioned earlier, the precinct is like a mini city that brings together all these different considerations and concerns around mobility, around built environment, energy, circular economy, data governance, etc. So onto our monitoring and evaluation and learning approach in action. What we did, again, informed by the motion handbook, we developed a self-assessment tool. It was as simple as putting something together in Miro, which I'll share with you shortly. And we invited our experiment leads to go through and fill out the self-assessment tool with guidance from myself and from Sam before, during, and after experimentation cycles. So that self-assessment tool was open throughout the entire process. Then we undertook qualitative interviews with the experiment leads at the end of cycle 1 and at the end of cycle 2. And what we were really focusing on through those interviews was trying to understand what is changing when your experiment occurs and to what level does that change contribute to transformative outcomes. Hence the focus on formative evaluation, right? And so what I'll share with you now is what that looked like. This is the self-assessment tool. We had an open Miro board where all of our experiment leads could use this approach and this framework to start filling out their inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and assumptions, right? And then they iteratively made changes to this as they were going about and doing their experiment. And they could see what the other experiment leads were going through in real time, and they could then iterate, adapt, make changes in a reflexive manner to their theory of change at an experiment level here within the self-assessment tool. Now, I'll spend the next few minutes talking about how this all came together in terms of a number of the experiments themselves and what some of the transformative outcomes look like. With the disclaimer that the Living Lab only ran for about a couple of years from start to finish. Some of that work is still ongoing and has had ripple effects. So we're talking about here some of the early signals in terms of transformative outcomes that were emerging. And this is a really good example. This is our very smiley, fresh-faced group of engineering honours students, final year project students who ran an experiment on circular food waste. And they undertook scoping research, I should say, front-runner interviews with a range of stakeholders, workshopping and prototyping using a strength-based method called asset mapping, and ran a co-design session. And that was with university staff, students, industry, government partners, and others as well. And then what that led to from that work, again, led by a student team, as you can see here, was that group working very closely with Monash Buildings and Property, the operations team that I mentioned earlier, over the course of this experiment, to the extent that they were invited by the Sustainability and Wellbeing Coordinator to deliver a university-wide webinar where they actually presented their recommendations for how to tackle food waste on campus. And then subsequently to that, the Buildings and Property team has also used their approach, which is called hotspots, in an all-team workshop, and they've shown interest in using front runners now in the decision-making processes and to inform the design of future food waste interventions on campus. So that's a really nice example of how this experiment led to these particular transformative outcomes related to both networking and institutional change. The next one I want to talk about is this another one by one of our PhD students, Grace Rogerson, who ran a workshop series, really trying to bring local government staff up to speed with the multi-level perspective and the X-curve, which I talked about earlier. And over a workshop series, she brought these actors together and really built capability around transformative governance. So we can see examples of actor empowerment here, where these local government staff didn't have the language or the vocabulary necessarily around multi-level perspective and the X-curve, but could see themselves in these processes, and it gave them those tools and those concepts and frameworks and language to understand how they could strengthen their role within the work that they're leading at that local government level, and enable them to describe, reflect, and direct their work more effectively. So that's another great example of actor empowerment in the context of this Living Lab portfolio. The next one I want to share with you is around this participatory urbanism or urban greening experiment that our good friend Lee, who's here with the hat on, he joined the portfolio. I invited him to join. We were really happy to have a local resident involved in the Living Lab portfolio. And he actually had been trying to get up an urban greening pilot for a while, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, as it were. And then through the Living Lab, we brought him together with one of our key partners, the city of Monash, and over about a 6-7 month period ran a really deep dive workshop series, which was really about developing relationships and trust building with the Parks and Recreation team, the sustainability team, biodiversity teams, and so on, to the extent that, again, examples here of navigating expectations and networking. Lee initially started out thinking this was an experiment to allow for the city of Monash to allow residents to go into the local park and do some regeneration work. But as it evolved, he saw the opportunity differently as a more of a coherent partnership between council and the community, to the extent that he got the green light to run this as a pilot, which is ongoing. And he was able to actually get a local council support to put signs up with QR codes, to get an email address and a website that would go to him and to council to try and go through this process of supporting residents to get more involved in urban greening and tree planting in the local government area where the precinct is situated. So that's another really great example in the context of the work around navigating expectations and networking. And then I think the last one to just quickly go through here is Shane French's experiment. Again, Shane is a staff member in Monash Buildings and Property, and he ran this series of cycling pop-up events with support from also the city of Monash, social enterprise called Brainwave Bikes that reconditions secondhand bikes, and Uniride, which is I think a student-led association which repairs bikes and has a bike repair and bike sale site on the main campus. And this is, again, is an example of actor empowerment, where through this work, Shane was able to connect people across the Monash ecosystem through grassroots activism, which he sees as the #1 priority, through this people-first approach to try and build momentum and support for more cycling to and from the campus, and to bring that together with work happening across the university and the Net Zero Precincts project, our project, but also the Green Impact team, the transport and circular economy teams. Okay, over to you, Christoph.
Thanks, Darren. We've got 31 responses, and thank you for participating. I just plucked them all in here, really, but I think we can see some of the things that you have just mentioned before, Darren. So the relationship part, the reframing, the thinking part, the knowledge diffusion part. So these are all coming through here. And before we go into the lessons learned from you, Darren, I just plugged this into AI for a little bit of help, and these 4 themes came out. So what did people think Living Labs are good at? It's about connecting people, forging new relationships, networks, and also transdisciplinary partnerships. And I think this came through your experiments quite strongly, Darren. It's the knowledge generation and the spreading part as well. So not just generating and producing new knowledge, but also sort of pushing it outside of the knowledge generation bit into other domains. Shifting mindset, reframing how people think, building a shared vision and changing perceptions. And this one here at the bottom is also interesting, and there were a few comments on that around making complexity actionable. So turning a messy challenge into a bounded experiment and a structured process that can be executed and becomes actionable. So these are some themes, and I think you probably will reflect on some of them in your lesson learned slide on the next one, right?
Yes, absolutely. And it'd be great to come back to this in the open discussion at the end. Thanks for sharing that, Christoph. That's great. So just to sort of bring this all together, again, this is a lovely image of our one of our studios in Cycle 2 with our amazing team of experiment leads and supporters and partners and researchers. And just to kind of wrap this up, the lessons learned really from the Net Zero Precincts Living Lab was that we can cultivate relationships across these institutional silos and sectoral boundaries. And again, that idea of an enabling environment for testing and demonstrating a range of solutions at different scales and domains of action. We built capability for new forms of collaborative and place-based transition governance, these sort of proof of concepts, right? And then, the Living Lab itself, importantly, became a vehicle for these diverse actors. I've mentioned staff, students, industry, government, business community actors to leverage diverse forms of knowledge and expertise to tackle these challenges. Because it's not just the responsibility in the domain of, one group of actors, researchers. We need to work with community, with industry, with government all together to try and come up with solutions that can be tested and scaled. So I'll encourage you now to have a look at our project publications. There's many of them. You can use that QR code to access our project website, which I encourage you to do. And that provides links to all these reports, the stage 1 report, which I talked about in the beginning, the visioning work in stage 2, the Living Lab work in stage 3, a number of publications which have come out, one in ICE that came out a couple of years ago from stage 1, another early book chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Energy Transitions. And I encourage you to keep a lookout for our final stage 4 report and our urban transitions framework, which is coming out later this year. And please do stay in contact with me here if you want to learn more about the Net Zero Precincts project, about Living Labs, about monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and transformative outcomes approach we drew on. I look forward to a bit of a discussion now that Christoph and I are going to facilitate with everyone. So thank you so much. How about we start off with, I have not been keeping track of the chat. Do we want to start, Christoph, with the chat, or do we want to have these sort of opening questions here to prompt us?
We do have some questions in the chat, so I guess we could start with those.
Yeah, let's start with those for sure.
Julia is asking, in how far was the Precinct project endorsed and supported by the university board? And her second question is, what do you think Living Labs are not good at, or what additional work scaffolding is needed to make them work?
Hi, Julia. It's great to have you here. So we worked really closely as we were developing the initial ideas for the Net Zero Precincts project with a range of stakeholders at the university to generate buy-in and shared ownership. And that process took probably about a year, really, before we even submitted the grant application to the Australian Research Council. It involved many workshops, many one-on-one and group discussions. And as I mentioned, we really had the support and blessing and the collaboration and input from the buildings and property team, who really see themselves as critical enablers and supporters of the university's core mission, which is research and teaching, right? And ultimately impact, generating impact. And so we had the blessing and support of buildings and property, and that was in really critical for us to be able to do this work and align it with the university's net zero agenda, to have contacts with the broader precinct community through various relationships and introductions that were brokered through those relationships and connections. So in that respect, that's how we navigated through those sort of, what can be tricky governance expectations or potential barriers, but we didn't really have any in that sense because we're on the same page in this regard. And then, sorry, Christoph, what was the follow-up, the second part of Julia's question?
The second question is what additional work or scaffolding is needed to make them work? But please, Julia, if you're still in the room, can probably phrase this question better, but what additional work scaffolding is needed to make them work? And also, how does this relate to the work that Sam is doing in terms of building up that infrastructure that you mentioned?
Yes, so I guess one of the big transformative outcomes related to this is there's we can't take sole credit for this, but through this work and by bringing buildings of property in and by us working so closely with them, we have had this. We've been very pleased to see this campus electrification strategy emerge, which is using living labs as a core approach to make that work happen. And also in parallel with this work, Sam Rai has been leading the Monash Living Labs platform to really bring together all of the living lab work that's being undertaken by the university. And I think to date, Sam sort of, accounted for over 20 of these sort of living labs across the entire Monash ecosystem. And so that has been a really an important vehicle for us to be able to build almost like a community of practice for this type of living lab style of working together across disciplines, across faculties, across research labs, and across research education and operations teams as well, and with a range of partners. So that I think is going to be a really exciting and important legacy for this work, seeing that living lab work continue through Sam's initiative and with the support of the research infrastructure portfolio as well. And there's a report that Sam put out recently on that. So if you look up Monash Living Labs, you'll be able to find that.
Stefan Böschen had a challenging question, a conceptual challenging question. I think he's still in the room, so I was wondering, Stefan, do you want to switch on your camera and your mic and grill Darren directly?
I'm in the room, but it might be too noisy. I try it. So, hi all, fantastic
Hi,
stuff.
Stefan. Good to see you.
It's about the thing. Well, we are labeling now a lot of research activities which are in this hybrid arena between research and society as living labs. It was formerly labeled as transdisciplinary research, and therefore I asked myself, well, what are the distinctions? How can we distinct between these different forms, or should we? I don't know, to make a specific conceptual consideration on this, so that we say, well, these are living labs, and this is transformative research or transdisciplinary research. Do you see differences? And if so, which ones? And what are the conceptual reasons to distinct between both?
Thanks so much, Stefan, for that very easy question to answer in a very short period of time. No, look, I would say the distinction, and of course, look, my good colleague Rob Raven has talked about this a lot, about how living labs are really boundary objects and you can come at them from many different perspectives. We've found them to be very useful as a collaborative arena to bring those diverse actors together. I think one of the key distinctions possibly is that it's, in the instance of this work, it's very much place-based. So we're trying to take this place-based approach to urban experimentation, as it were, using this living lab framework, which is informed obviously by transition management and design anthropology. But I think living labs become this vehicle where you can distill a lot of those complex ideas and frameworks and translate them for industry, government, community partners in a way which is palatable, right? And so it's a way, I think, to de-risk some of that work and thinking, especially for actors like government, local and state and other levels of government, who are quite sometimes cautious, understandably, of working with, community and others to do this kind of work. But a living lab, I think, provides this kind of, transition arena for diverse actors to come together in place-based settings, having very strong reflexive monitoring in place, again, to be able to kind of focus on that, intention and directionality that I talked about earlier. But again, it's going to have overlap within interdisciplinary research. But I think maybe the place-based aspects of this are what is most significant, especially in this context.
We have a few people in the room who have experience with living labs. So if anyone else wants to reflect on that distinction, please just raise your hand or contribute to the chat and feel free to participate. We do have a question from Sandra. She was wondering where that empowerment, the actor empowerment transformative outcome came up. It's not part of the initial list of 12 transformative outcomes by Bipashi Ghosh. So how can you tell us about that, Darren?
Yeah, look, I have an interest in it. I've, did my PhD on, transformative urban experimentation, very much looking at agency enabling processes, and became very familiar with the work of Avellino and others on empowerment and so on, especially in that kind of socio-institutional kind of context from a transitions perspective. And as I said, it came up in the work through the fact that our experiment leads had not had any exposure or involvement in living labs before. And we noticed as they were going through this onboarding process that Sam and I were facilitating over that 6 to 9 month period in that initiating phase of the work, we could see significant changes happening in terms of especially the PhD students' confidence, understanding of the tools and methods and approach and the living lab style of work, engagement, importantly, with industry, government, community partners. And so it just seemed natural to then call that actor empowerment. And so I thought it would have been remiss for us not to have paid attention to that as we were going through the monitoring and evaluation process, because I think it would have been the project would have been the poorer for not showcasing or spotlighting that aspect of the work. And that's sort of, at a conceptual level, that's where it sort of comes from. But then practically and in terms of as a facilitator, as a portfolio facilitator and coordinator, it seemed like an obvious outcome that needed that story to be told.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that also partially answers the question from Julia before on what additional work and scaffolding is needed to make living labs work, actually.
Yes.
We have another question by Bipashi. She's saying it's inspiring work. But Bipashi, if you're still in the room, please turn your camera on and please ask Darren directly. I feel a bit silly reading this out when you're here.
Yeah, I can do that, but I'm on the I'm traveling, so maybe without camera. So yeah, I think this is really great. My question was more about the kind of future of this beyond the project, when the project ends. So you are in the final phase. So yeah, I was just wondering what could have been, whether there has been discussions around mainstreaming or kind of more institutionalizing some of the practices, some of the initiatives, like the circular food waste, or anything that you see has will or you hope that will stick and kind of continue on beyond the scope of the living lab. So it's trying to kind of see scalability and mainstreaming, basically.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Bipashi. Good to have you here. Yeah, look, we're in deep discussions with colleagues and stakeholders in the precinct about extending this work through a circular economy living lab, through another living lab, which is looking at sort of like regenerative design in the precinct. Another one I mentioned is Sam's work with buildings and property on campus electrification. So I think that this is this project and this living lab and the portfolio of experiments has demonstrated in a compelling way how living lab ways of work can actually be an important collaborative vehicle for this transformative kind of work to happen. And then through the ongoing discussions we're having at that institutional level at the university, but within the broader precinct, we're hoping to continue this down the track through additional projects that we're looking to get funding for, and to bring additional, existing and additional partners on board for down the track. So I think it's inspired us to keep going, and we hope to see this as really the starting point for ongoing place-based living lab experimentation, in the precinct and beyond.
We have another question by Rob, and I just nudged him in the chat to ask you directly. So, Rob, please, over to you.
Yeah, hi. So basically, I think it is kind of like the opposite question as Stefan had. I think in your answer to Stefan, you basically said that a living lab is both transdisciplinary research with place-based governance. But to what degree do you actually need like the research part of it with the governance? Because did you also identify a lot of activities that were not really novel but still quite crucial? Maybe not really that required a lot of learning, or maybe that those were kind of boring to look at.
Rob, do you want to just distill that into a question for me?
Yeah, to what degree do you actually need a lot of, did you also find a lot of interventions or activities that did not really require a lot of like novelty or learning, but were still quite crucial to the net zero agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I can give an example of, there were various unexpected, unintended things that sort of took place. There was another experiment looking at getting access to building occupancy data, for example, from a particular team within buildings and property that one of our PhD students in the Faculty of IT was leading. And this particular student was developing these models based on a number of assumptions about how building occupancy worked. And through the living lab, and again, this is not necessarily leading to novelty, but it's more about navigating expectations and networking. We brought her in almost on a secondment to that particular team within buildings and property, so she could meet with the key decision makers and understand this is actually how the university deals with building occupancy, and this is actually the real world data sets that they're using and what they have access to and what they can share. And so that through that living lab experiment and the reflexive monitoring process and that transformative outcomes approach, that particular experiment lead was very much able to adjust what they were doing, go from quite an abstract, hypothetical or theoretical approach to more of a grounded real world model of how building occupancy data could be used effectively in a pragmatic way. So I don't know if that kind of answers your questions, but there's these little kind of lots of little stories about, how the living lab opens up these opportunities for relationship building, for people to sort of question their assumptions, to overcome obstacles that it wouldn't have been possible without the umbrella of the living lab and the portfolio and the approach, enabling people to feel open and comfortable enough to kind of share their knowledge in that way.
Yeah, that answered it. Thank you.
We are on time, but I was wondering if we have a little bit more for one question, just because I already nudged Karen to ask Darren directly. Do we have time for one more question, David? Darren, is that all right?
Sure.
Yes, absolutely.
Good morning, everybody. I'm from Ontario, Canada, and I do a lot of work in the community around food system, education, building the local food system, so very much place-based. And I'm just wondering how we can bring together community practitioners and living labs to add the theoretical knowledge to the community work, or how you see that intersection.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Great to have you with us. I mean, again, I point back to Grace's experiment where she was working with those local government staff who had no exposure to these conceptual frameworks and that language and vocabulary and tools and so on, and methods, and through her work was able to again empower those actors to build capability by having exposure to these tools, by working with them, by discussing them, using them to address their own real world projects and challenges that they were facing, and how to navigate through that in a complex local government environment. And so I would say you go down potentially a similar path with community actors, and start from, meet them where they're at, like in terms of play to their strengths. What assets and strengths do they have in their local context that can be enabled and empowered, and then understand what their needs are, and then bring this type of thinking to them, and go on a journey together to see what kind of solutions can be developed, and what kind of learning can take place through this type of work.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Darren, and thank you, Christoph. I think we're probably going to have to end it there. We have had one other question, which is a very good question from Sayan Sundar. How can we standardize the parameters to be a common goal for other universities' use in governance and policy levels? I think it's quite a big question. It's probably one for us to take away and mull over for all of us, how we can institutionalize this within our own contexts. Certainly something that we can continue the discussion with, but thank you for that question. And I think we'll probably need a bit of mulling over for that one. But obviously feel free to contact Darren directly, any of you that are here today. I don't want to overrun the time too much. So thank you so much, Darren and Christoph, for offering this session. It's been incredibly inspiring, both in terms of the number of projects that this has engendered, but also the way that you spoke at the beginning about making this very accessible and engaging to people at all levels. I'm really impressed with all of the work that you've been doing. I also want to thank you because I know that it's quite late now in Melbourne, so thank you so much for staying online and working this late in the evening. And Christoph, thank you so much for all of your facilitation as well with this session. It's been really fantastic. Just in terms of upcoming OLS sessions, open learning sessions that we've got in the coming weeks, we've actually got one tomorrow, which is a Spanish language session being run by colleagues in TIPSI's Latin American hub. So that's around energy communities and eco-social transitions, and talks about a comparative study between Chile and the United Kingdom. And then on the 18th of March, we've got a session, again, Spanish language, on transformative innovation policy instruments applied in looking at Medellin as a special district of science, technology, and innovation within Colombia. We are talking to colleagues to see if any of these sessions can be run in English as well, if colleagues felt confident enough to do that. And so keep an eye on our TIPSI LinkedIn channels, our other socials, for more information on that. And that just leaves me to thank you all for coming, and thank you so much to Darren and Christoph again. It's been a fantastic session. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.